Boy, Big Nate. Welcome back to Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best reading clubs. And today we got a dope ass essay we're talking about. We are going to be doing a selected essay from the Chomsky Reader, The Manufacture of Consent. So I'm very excited to talk about it. It's going to deal with the nature of propaganda, the way in which media can be used to manipulate public opinion, and the way in which government uses propaganda as a control mechanism for the population. We're going to get into a ton of good stuff. But as the chat filters in, the hundreds, as they come through the floodgates, I'm going to, as per tradition, just talk about what I have been reading lately. So I already got my cup of tea brewed as well. So let me take a little initiatory sip. And just like that, we live. So, all right, what has Big Nate been reading? I know it's on everybody's mind. Right now, well, for one, I DNF'd Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie. Just because it wasn't speaking to me. Maybe at some other point in time I will come back to it, but I don't know. I got like 50 pages into it, and it was good. It was cool. There's definitely some good lines and stuff, but overall, I'm just not feeling compelled to continue with this book. So there was a few things that kind of annoyed me about it as well, but we'll get into that later. So recently I decided to pick up Moby Dick, and I'm like 50 or so pages in, and I am thoroughly enjoying this book. In fact, much more than I thought I would. A lot of the classics, sometimes they'd be like rewarding and whatnot, but kind of challenging and boring, and I kind of thought Moby Dick would be in that vein, but honestly, so far, I'm loving this story. I'm loving the writing. And the other book I've been reading, which I've been mentioning to you all, is The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. But I actually have not touched it since last week. And that's because I ended up going down to Phoenix and doing all this other stuff. But because, and normally I would have read it by now, but Moby Dick has just been compelling me so much that every morning during my morning read time, usually I kind of alternate. But for this one, I just been wanting to read Moby Dick, so I've been reading it. So, okay, here, one sec. Let me just do some, technical difficulties. Cool Colt was good. Good to see you, a regular. So, yeah, that's Moby Dick. What else? That's pretty much it. Some miscellaneous stuff here and there I've been reading. But, and of course, what I've also been reading is The Manufacture of Consent. So, we are going to go through this. Yes, Big Nate back indeed with his cup of tea. Oh my goodness, I'm just so excited to be here with you all. But yeah, I think without further ado, we can get right into it. Also, a little FYI, I got the westward facing sun. We got no AC, and I'm drinking this hot tea. So if I start sweating profusely, you finna know why. There's a book by Edward Edinger where he does a Jungian breakdown of Moby Dick, in case that sounds cool. That sounds very cool. And yeah, there's been some interesting psychology stuff going on here. I know Cormac McCarthy was very influenced by Moby Dick as well. And I remember I read some quote, and like a passage from this book, like a long time ago in some random ass place, and it was just like, it was a really perfect description of like just the nature of the unconscious. And I know he's got like this psychological battle with the whale. So right now, bro's just prepping for the trip. There's some fun character, Queequeg, for instance. I won't get into all that for now, but I'm really liking where this is going, and the characters themselves. What's up, Enlightened? Good to see you. I started going through Concerning the Spiritual in Art by Kandinsky since you recommended it, and the author definitely has the sauce. Yes, glad you, yeah, I enjoyed that essay. I thought that was like there's a lot of interesting stuff. It's not like amazing, but I think there's a lot of really good stuff. I debated doing that on the channel at some point, just because it goes obviously into the nature of art and everything. So, yeah, I'll be curious at if you guys feel inclined to let me know what you guys are reading. And as we do that, I think we can just get right into it. So let's do it. My stream's still good, right? I'm not too loud. I think I got the technical stuff figured out by now. But okay, so we're gonna be talking about The Manufacture of Consent. You don't know how I do two books at one. I'm in the middle of Don Quixote. Only thing I'm reading. I mean, Don Quixote definitely could be could take all your time, but I don't know. The way I like to have two books, Big Nation, yeah, making use of the emojis. I need to put some more. I should have 4 or 5. I had this whole thing where I did because you can do GIFs. So I literally set up my everything, did a whole thing of me just taking a dope, blowing it, and it's just like we smoking loud. It's literature, but they did not approve that one. They gave me the email too. They said like They made me think I got it. It said, "Big Nate, your emoji has been rejected!" Exclamation mark. I'm like, well, gee, thanks. Glad you're so excited about it. Between 5 books, I can't starting new ones. Yeah, no. So I like to have at least 2 books, and usually when they're of different genres. And I don't know why. I mean, I used to just like cycle through them. Washington hater. No, I mean, honestly, 1 book is probably better because it just takes me twice as long to finish each other book. But I don't know. Sometimes I like the variation. Sometimes I'll read for like half hour, 45 minutes, and it's like I still want to read, but I just need to switch it up. I don't know if that's just a me thing, but yeah, back in college, I used to bring 3 books and like just a chapter of each of them and just cycle through, which that one I wouldn't recommend. 5 books, I would say 5 books is a little too much, but depending on the nature of the books, because arguably I'm reading like 5 too. You know, books of short stories, books of essays, I hit one here, I hit one there, you know how it goes. But am I reading those actively? Not necessarily, so. But how are you liking Don Quixote, Washington? I'm curious, and where you're at also. But yeah. So as you guys are just leaving comments and whatnot, so just a little way of caveat. Obviously, I have the Chomsky Reader, and so we're doing the manufacture of consent, and I think it's technically like slightly abridged, but I think it has the core essential elements of the essay, and I think we're gonna have a lot to talk about. So, without further ado, I think we can I've said that like 3 times now, but this time let's actually get into the essay. Okay, so he starts it off with basically like this little anecdote. He says, during the Thanksgiving holiday a few weeks ago, I took a walk with some friends and family in a national park. We came across a gravestone which had on it the following inscription: "Here lies an Indian woman, a Wampanoag, whose family and tribe gave of themselves and their land that this great nation might be born and grow." So this is like a first little kind of introduction to, just a very relatively innocuous, but is going to lead us into the larger ideas of the principles of propaganda just in general. He says, of course, it is not quite accurate to say that the indigenous population gave of themselves and their land for that noble purpose. Rather, they were slaughtered, decimated, and dispersed in the course of one of the greatest exercises in genocide in human history. Current estimates suggest that Current estimates suggest that there may have been about 80 million Native Americans in Latin America when Columbus discovered the continent, as we say, and about 12 to 15 million more north of the Rio Grande. By 1650, about 95% of the population had been wiped out, and by the time the continental borders of the United States had been established, some 200,000 were left of the indigenous population. In short, mass genocide on a colossal scale, which we celebrate each October when we honor Columbus, a notable mass murder himself on Columbus Day. So this is we're getting our first kind of introduction example, right? He just kind of passed by this tombstone. Here lies an Indian woman who gave of themselves and their land that this great nation might be born and grow. And this is like, I think, again, just one of the first examples where just whitewashing or reinterpreting, revising, I think that's where the term revisionary history comes from. And just the actual, and making a complete euphemism of what was one of the greatest genocides of American history. I mean, not just American history, all human history. And, but you completely wipe all that out, right? The verbs he used here, slaughtered, decimated, and dispersed in this genocide. But of course, all of that gets reduced to this one, tombstone, who they gave of themselves. It almost sounds noble, like they were making some kind of higher sacrifice for the greater prosperity of the country. But, that's obviously a complete distortion of what actually took place. 80 mil really stuck me as being a ton. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of what's interesting. So he's going to talk about this too, but I think in conventional American history, we are, this part is kind of glossed over, and it's very much, made into euphemism. Like, if they admit there was some kind of genocide, there's usually some kind of caveats, and you don't know the full extent. But this, I agree, Cool Colt. This was an insane number. 80 million Native Americans, and we had wiped out, 95%. Only 200,000 were left. There was a whole civilization that was existing in this country. I mean, and this is with the Christopher Columbus stuff, when Columbus discovered America. And this is also more or less how I was taught it. You know, Columbus discovered North America. Well, like, the caveat is, well, actually, technically, Leif Erikson was the first one who discovered North America, but then it was Columbus. It's like, actually, aside from all of that, there was an indigenous population here by the millions, and, you know, they had whole ass civilizations. And, you know, we literally just, the fact of the matter is, we just wiped them out at a colossal scale to essentially make room for our own country. In a very selfish way, obviously. But, you know, and then we're going to talk about some ways in which that fact gets distorted or manipulated or just erased altogether. So he goes on, he says, hundreds of American citizens, well-meaning and decent people, troop by that gravestone regularly and read it, apparently without reaction. They might react differently if they were to visit Auschwitz or Dachau and find a gravestone reading, "Here lies a woman, a Jew whose family and people gave of themselves and their possessions that this great nation might grow and prosper." And I love this example that he gives here. You know, the Holocaust, which I think all, you know, universally is taught as, you know, I mean, I don't know how, there of course could be some level of like whitewashing and propagandizing, but United States doesn't necessarily have motivation to do that. So I mean, the Holocaust, at least in my experience, was taught as one of the most, you know, brutal, horrific genocides in history. And I think that really, I think, you know, people recognize that. But, you know, so imagine, right, the analogous thing is with the Native Americans, but imagine you had read, and it's just, you know, morally reprehensible to even think that, you know, somebody would put, "Here lies a woman, a Jew, who gave of themselves and their possessions." Because, you know, that completely distorts the actual reality of it, which is that, you know, millions of people were rounded up, sent to concentration camps, discriminated against, killed, tortured, you know, essentially all the things that the United States did to Native Americans. And, you know, you know, hundreds of American citizens, well-meaning and decent people, troop by that gravestone and apparently, you know, don't have any reaction to it. So this is already one of the first examples that Chomsky is going to be talking about in terms of, you know, what propaganda actually looks like. Washington says Columbus started trafficking little Taino girls as soon as he landed in the Caribbean. Yeah, it's just absolutely full of horror stories. And the truth is, like, I personally don't even, I meant, like, the whole fact of the United States genociding the Native American population, it took a little bit of extra, like, you know, work, like individual research in some sense, just based aside from like the conventional American education. And, you know, aside from that, you know, we probably don't even know the fullest extent. And there's a lot of facts out there in Washington. Like, this is a good example of facts that are observed but not seen, which is something he's gonna, I don't know why that just did that. Terrible timing. But observed but not seen. And so, yeah, we'll talk about all that. But yeah, truly just a reprehensible person. And I mean, for so many reasons. And, you know, he talks about how we still honor Columbus every Columbus Day. And even now, when there's kind of like, you know, modern pushback towards this notion, like, okay, maybe Columbus wasn't actually a good guy, and we should change the nature of this holiday and who we're honoring. You know, there's still a ton of pushback from people who, like, you know, these are the same, I mean, I don't know if they're the same people, but, like, you know, the people who find pride in the Confederate flag and all this stuff. This is like the kind of stuff that I think is propaganda at work. You know, people who are actively fighting not to erase Columbus Day because it's, you know, too woke or something like that, which, again, we will talk about the nature of diverting attention from the real issues and things like that. But okay, so just going on here, Chomsky says the sentiment on the gravestone of the Wampanoag woman is not original. 160 years ago, John Quincy Adams explained in a 4th of July address that our government is superior to all others because it was based upon consent, not conquest. Hey, thank you for the tier 1 sub. I appreciate it. Nice. I don't get how the gifting works. Does that mean like somebody else gets the sub? Because that's dope. Gifted a tier 1 sub to eat my light. Okay, nice. Appreciate that. But okay, so John Quincy Adams is giving this you know, totally bullshit kind of speech about how it's based in, you know, America's better, right? We're morally better because we're not about conquest. We're about consent. The first settlers, immediately after landing, purchased from the Indian natives the right of the settlement upon the soil. Thus was a social compact formed upon the elementary principle of civil society, in which conquest and servitude had no part, right? Yeah, conquest and servitude had no part, right? The slough of brutal force was entirely cast off. All was voluntary. All was unbiased consent. All was the agreement of soul with soul. And this, again, in light of the facts of what actually happened, is just a reprehensible statement. I mean, to take his earlier example, imagine if somebody in the Nazi government made the same thing, right? Oh, the Jewish people, gave of themselves. They let their property be taken. They let themselves be rounded up. Imagine if they said all was voluntary, all was unbiased consent, all was the agreement of soul with soul. So this, again, we are getting the whitewashing, the total distortion and reimagining of what actually happened in history, right? They said they purchased the land from the Indian natives, which again is just like, it's just a excuse for them for what they actually did. I mean, I don't know the degree to which that actually took place, but even if they did, I mean, surely it doesn't account for 95% of 80 million people being exterminated. Even if they didn't, sell their land, I wonder what the people would have done anyway. And also, this is just like a totally bullshit excuse, right? And this idea that all was voluntary, agreement and soul with soul. Yeah, without conquest and servitude, except when I do it. Yeah, exactly. Powerful tool. I like the wordplay there. I see you, Washington. I gotta learn how to swallow my drinks. Wow. Okay, so going on here, T.D. Allman observes that the American national experience of genocidal slaughter of the Indian is nearly non-existent. They were not, quote, this is a quote, they were not human beings. They were only obstacles to the inexorable triumph of American virtue, who must be swept away to make room for a new reality of American freedom. It's like you say, without conquest and servitude, except for when I do it. And this idea, the American national experience of genocide slaughter is nearly non-existent. I think that's true, like my own experience. And, I was in Arizona, which is one of the worst education systems or states in the country, so that might have something to do with it. But this really wasn't, I mean, I don't have a strong recollection of learning about the real true history. I think we might have got a little bit of like the Trail of Tears, but this idea that it's nearly non-existent. I mean, in some place like Germany, right, where there's a huge amount of emphasis on, like, it's illegal to deny the Holocaust, for instance, in Germany, and there's a massive level of cultural consciousness for that event. When you compare that to something like with the United States and Native Americans, there's nothing on that scale. It's nearly non-existent. First time chat, what's up, Vesper High? His ideals and virtues sound solid but are incongruent with what was happening at the time. Yeah. It's sometimes like patriots want all the nostalgia of being connected to a great nation's history. Yes, exactly. Like this element of grandeur and a great nation being like, we because the constant high horse and the constant excuse that they use to do horrible things onto others is in the name of the great virtues of, America. But then absolve themselves of being connected to genocide, saying that they weren't alive then. Yeah, that's a good point. It wasn't I never had slaves, right? It's like the country still gets all the benefits while everyone's able to kind of absolve themselves, as you say, of blame. So they have no part. It's just endorphins from only seeing history as a tool, ego boost, just a connection to an imagined community, nationalism. Yeah, right. There's plenty to be angry about in American history. Genocide still happening now in Sudan. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing, too. We might talk about, I mean, the whole stuff with, like, Israel and Palestine as well. Like, Israel has a right to defend itself. That itself is kind of like a propaganda slogan for what is unabashedly a genocide just happening before our eyes. And maybe we can, get more into that, because Chomsky actually talks a little bit about Palestine and this essay. So, so just, total BS. But going on here, he says, the consensus has been that our own solemnly proclaimed rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness totally superseded the rights of the peoples whose lives, liberties, and happiness we were expunging from the face of the earth. So it's like, I already forgot who said it, but, conquest and servitude, except when we do it, right? So we are, all our great virtues of the American society, the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What could be more noble than this? Except it comes at the expense of, the entire civilization's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that had already been existing for centuries before Columbus, again, quote unquote, discovered America. And the way they frame this, he says, the Indians were the first aggressors, the definition of aggressor being that we have attacked them, to be followed by Mexicans, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Nicaraguans, and many others. So this is a theme I think that's going to come up as well, this idea that America, for instance, is always on the defensive, even when it's entirely our fault, right? We came and, just started slaughtering Native Americans. And I'm assuming what he's talking about, they at some level started to fight back, and it's like, oh, well, now the Indians are the aggressors, right? We're just defending ourselves, which is obviously a complete misrepresentation of what actually happened. Facebook is responsible. Yeah, so, okay, we do it via proxy nowadays. Yes, yeah, exactly. And that's also where I think a lot of the propaganda can come from. Even though, Israel is, from my understanding, very much an American proxy, but we can have this level of separation, and we can use the fact that it's not directly, the United States in, tons of ways in terms of propaganda, all while at the same time maintaining and perpetuating the American regime, so to speak, in the Middle East. He talks about somebody, an American sociologist, Franklin Henry Giddings, who coins the phrase consent without consent. And so he gives an example. If in later years, he wrote, the colonized see and admit that the disputed relation was for the highest interest, it may be reasonably held that authority has been imposed with the consent of the governed. Just as we may say that a young child gives consent without consent when its parents prevent it from running into the street. Or if it was up to kids, they would just watch cartoons and eat junk food all day, right? But as parents, that it's really in their own best interest, right? It's like if they had all the information, they saw the consequences, if they really had an understanding of their situation, they would obviously give consent to things like this. And so that's the kind of narrative that is being portrayed not only here, with the, that is even related to the constant reference of Native Americans by the United States as as savages, and they came and they were completely uncivilized, and so America comes in to help lift them up through civilization. That's this idea of consent without consent. Which is, of course, total bullshit. They had a full-fledged, multi-century civilization that was here before we had even, knew the continent existed. That's just absurd. And so he gives, kind of more examples of this in the nature of propaganda. When he goes on a tour of a much-respected college he refers to, and he's going through a cathedral. And he's talking about the stained glass window, this artistic display. It showed a man sitting at a desk signing some document with an Air Force officer standing nearby. An American bomber was shown in the background, and on a blackboard we read E equals MC squared. Though it is difficult to believe at first, the stained glass window in this cathedral is celebrating the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what Truman described at the time as the greatest thing in history. So here we have this whole... imagine if there was an art installation. Well, okay, so what he's saying is there is this huge art installation ultimately honoring the, what is it? What's the word? Making more noble? I don't know. But just... honor it. No, I already said honoring. I forget. It's on the tip of my tongue. I don't know what it is. But basically, there's this whole artistic display honoring what was, another horrible, heinous action in American history. And again, you can imagine, what if there was a stained glass window with, in this case, there's somebody signing a document, which I'm presuming is the go ahead and bomb Japan, and there is a American bomber, and E equals MC squared. Imagine if there was some equivalent with Nazi SS soldiers and things just glorify. That was the word I was looking for. Glorifying something like the Holocaust. It's like he says, though it is difficult to believe at first, the stained glass, it literally kind of defies belief. the way, and I think this is the way a lot of propaganda works. Once you see the light, so to speak, and you understand what's actually happening, some of this stuff is just so egregiously obvious, and so obviously too in bad faith. So Israel is practically a colony of the United States. There's like 15 to 17 American military bases there. Netanyahu was raised in Philly, and his family is also from Philly. Yeah, I'm not gonna pretend like I'm an expert in what's going on there, but that is also my understanding. Is they're very much they're absolutely a proxy for the United States, and obviously we're just completely funding their genocide, without which they would not be able to do it. And I've heard just a common thing is they call like Israel like the 51st state, because it's basically an extension of the United States. But of course, they're going to have all this. They're going to have all the part of the propaganda is, they would never admit that. This is just they call Israel, one of the only democracies in the Middle East, and that's why we're supporting them. And it has all these other reasons where ultimately, obviously, something much more nefarious and self-interested is going on. But also just, again, this idea that there's a huge artistic exhibit at a much respected college. I don't know what it is. I bet I could have tracked that down. Which college has a stained glass window glorifying the atomic bomb? And as he says, Truman described it as the greatest thing in history. Not everyone, incidentally, felt quite that way. The distinguished Indian jurist Radhabinod Pal, basically someone at the Tokyo Tribunal, says that if any indiscriminate destruction of civilian life and property is still illegitimate in warfare, then in the Pacific War, this decision to use the atom bomb is the only near approach to the directives of the Nazi leaders during the Second World War. So, so long as during war we value civilian life and property and want to avoid the unnecessary destruction of that, right? As long as that's a general moral principle, even in war, then the atomic bomb is second to only something as horrible a scale as the Holocaust. And so he goes on, the process of creating, and this is kind of where we get like the definition of propaganda in some sense. We've kind of been working our way up to this, but here it is kind of formalized in some way. The process of creating and entrenching highly selective, reshaped, or completely fabricated memories of the past is what we call indoctrination or propaganda when it is conducted by official enemies in education, moral instruction, or character building when we do it ourselves. So this idea, I really like this phrase as a way of describing it. Creating and entrenching highly selective, reshaped, or completely fabricated memories. That is, in some ways, what propaganda is. And, the rise and fall of the Third Reich, which I've been reading, Hitler is a master propagandist. One of the first things he did to take control, and which was wildly successful, was essentially to ban the free press and to, have complete control of what press does go out there. And a huge part of his wartime efforts and getting public approval from it is in things like, in Poland and in Czechoslovakia and all these different places. They are literally just making stories up, completely fabricated, of like Germans being just absolutely obliterated, just being absolutely shit on. Like I think one of the examples, they coming up with the most horrific shit, like a pregnant woman. I'm pretty sure this was like an actual example. Like a pregnant woman was killed and they took the baby out and started kicking the baby's head like it's a ball or some shit like that. I don't know. I don't know exactly if that was in the book, but the point being that they really just put out the most heinous and, again, totally false information. And they just, flooded. If your only source of media is, completely under the rule of a totalitarian state like Hitler, that's all you're going to get. And William Shirer, who is like the American journalist in Germany, when he talks to people, he's like, for the most part, these people totally bought it. They could not see through it. And it's like, you try and have a conversation with them and they look at you like you're crazy for, thinking otherwise. This is where like that real dystopian shit gets, yeah, exactly. Like you said, Enlightened. 1984 had great themes on propaganda. So, that's this whole, idea. Again, creating and entrenching highly selective, reshaped, or completely fabricated memories. I mean, the whole justification for Hitler to invade Poland, it was terrible, terrible shit. And again, totally fabricated. They basically took concentration members, dressed them up in Polish uniforms, and like staged a fake attack on them onto like some post in Germany that was there, basically to say that the Poles had instituted this, the final straw of aggression, and the entire thing was orchestrated by Germany. So, and then that's in terms of like, the complete, that's just like making things up that never actually happened, let alone the kind of, the tweaking or the bending of the truth, the omitting of certain things, right? There's so many ways in which this can happen. And, again, we're not immune from it. He said, we call it propaganda when it's conducted by official enemies. But for us, when we do it, it's called education, moral instruction, character building. And, this is also related to, Carl Jung. He talks about how in the East and the West during, I think it was the Cold War, we accused them of doing all these these diplomatic deceptions, and using diplomatic deceptions and using propaganda and, doing all these things that literally, like also, supporting the overthrow, supporting the spread of communism and, this, that, and the other. And we were literally doing all the exact same things here in the West. So when they do it, again, it's like, I already forget who said it again, but it's when they do it, or when we do it, it's okay, but not when they do it. You are not immune to propaganda. Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, there really is no, way around it, and it's so pervasive. That's why I think this essay is super relevant, especially today. Also, real quick, I'm gonna turn some lights. I feel like it's getting a little dark. The sun is setting. So here, give me 1 second. I'm gonna turn these lights on. All right. I feel like I should read 1984 again. I'm editing a video for Big Nate's book reviews on I'm like tier ranking modern classics, and 1984 came up, and I feel like I'm due for I should reread that, and especially like now given the dystopian nature. And if you say there's good themes on propaganda, yeah, that's all the more relevant. All this yapping, a brother got a drink. Okay, so where were we? Okay, so we're just talking about, again, the nature of propaganda. And so he goes on. Yeah. So he's talking about this whole principle, right? It is a valuable mechanism of control since it effectively blocks any understanding of what is happening in the world. One crucial goal of successful education is to deflect attention elsewhere, say to Vietnam or Central America or the Middle East, where our problems allegedly lie, and away from our own institutions and their systematic functioning and behavior, the real source of a great deal of the violence and suffering in the world. It is crucially important to prevent understanding and to divert attention from the sources of our own conduct so that elite groups can act without popular constraints to achieve their goal. And I think that's just like, an absolute banger of a passage. The nature of deflecting attention and preventing understanding. Like right now in American culture, there's, so disproportionately high emphasis on, woke culture and trans people in sports and like, pronouns and Biden and just things that are, totally inconsequential, right? The big problems in the United States right now are we don't have healthcare. People can hardly, people are living paycheck to paycheck. There's a massive housing crisis where people can't afford to live in homes. There's homelessness is rampant, the opiate crisis. There's a ridiculous amount of things that are actually the problem in the United States, and we are, the nature of propaganda. I love this too. He says we have to prevent understanding and divert attention so that elite groups can act without popular constraints. And again, you have someone who like Elon Musk, who just bought one of the biggest social media companies in existence, which obviously has a huge impact on the nature of propaganda, the nature of media, and also the nature of preventing understanding and deflecting attention from the real issues, right? So much, and it works too. A lot of these people I'm gonna say on both sides, but I would say particularly, like conservatives, they are just hyper focused on things that absolutely do not matter. The thing with like trans people and pronouns, like how much of that really affects your life, and things like immigration. They talk like, oh, immigrants are, what's wrong with this country, and it's like if you ask them to name one single thing about like, policy or how it actually affects them, they can't say a thing. And this is propaganda at work, right? This is getting people infuriated and taking their anger out on something that is totally unrelated so that the elites at the highest level can continue to do what they want unobstructed by public opinion. So yeah, like you said, Enlightened, these are decoys. These are essentially, cultural, political decoys so that they can continue doing whatever they want to, continue their, selfish capitalist or, whatever, at some level governmental going on. So, okay, going on here. A few days ago, the World Court rejected the American contention that it had no jurisdiction with regard to U.S. aggression against Nicaragua. The issue arose last April when Nicaragua brought to the court its charge that the United States was mining its harbors and attacking its territory. With exquisite timing, President Reagan chose that very day to issue a presidential proclamation designating May 1st as Law Day 1984. So basically this example that he's giving is there is a world court, right, of which all these major nations are a part of, and they ruled in favor, right, based off all the evidence and the testimony from Nicaragua, right? They ruled that the U.S. was basically in the wrong here, and as he says, they were mining its territories and attacking the country. And so they ruled that America are the bad guys here, right? They are guilty in light of the World Court. But as President Reagan, as he says, he happened to choose that very day to issue a presidential proclamation about Law Day, and he says. Basically, that as celebration of the rule of law, he had announced that the United States would not recognize any decision of the World Court, and that was the day before. So he just happens to, say he comes up with this whole idea of Law Day in honor and appreciation of the nature of law and order in the United States. We're going to reject whatever. We're not acknowledging any ruling by the World Court. Well, lo and behold, that's you can see why they did that, right? This is a manipulation of public opinion so that to obfuscate the actual immoral actions of the country. And so he gives an example. He says it happened before in almost exactly the same way. In 1907, a Central American Court of Justice In 1907, a Central American Court of Justice was established at the initiative of Washington to adjudicate conflicts among the states of the region. So this was established, again, at the initiative of Washington, at the initiative of the United States. Within 9 years, the institution was hollow because twice the United States refused to recognize court decisions that went against its interests in Nicaragua. In 1912, the court condemned U.S. military intervention in Nicaragua. Washington simply ignored the ruling. In 1916, the court upheld a Costa Rican claim that U.S. actions in Nicaragua infringed its rights, and again, the United States simply disregarded the decision, effectively destroying the court. So, the whole thing was, set up as a, again, by the initiative of the United States. But the second that it actually is an obstacle in the way of whatever the U.S.'s intentions are, well, then all of a sudden we're just going to ignore it, right? And that completely puts the whole thing in shambles. And I mean, this is related to things that, again, are like happening in the U.S. For instance, we accidentally deported Abrego Garcia to El Salvador. It was admitted that was a mistake. And even though the Supreme Court had ruled unanimously, right, that he needs to be brought back, he recently was, thank goodness, but for months he was, Trump just completely flouted the order and refused to do it. And the only reason he did do it is because it was ultimately taken out of his hands. But again, this idea, we have the courts, we have all these things set in place to, at the very least, give this illusion of checks and balances and democracy and all this, right? But, the second that is not actually enforced, the second that it's just ignored, which is exactly what happened, the whole thing falls to shambles. So, he's giving some examples of the nature of propaganda and the way in which governments, not just, I think he would say, not just the United States, but the way in which they use this to their benefit in order to further their own agenda. Sit break. In my videos, you guys don't see all the sip breaks I be taking. I edit them out because no one's trying to watch that. But a man can't do all this yapping without a little bit of tea. So okay, he goes on to say, it's easy enough to make fun of Ronald Reagan, but that is itself a diversion from the main point. Violence, deceit, and lawlessness are natural functions of the state, any state. And so, again, we can criticize individual leaders, but the larger point here is that violence, deceit, lawlessness, these are natural functions of the United States, but also any state in general. And then he's going to move on to this point pretty soon here, the idea that the contribution of the harshest critics actually reinforce the system of indoctrination. He says the great achievement of the critics is to prevent the realization that what is happening today is not some departure from our historical ideals and practice to be attributed to the personal failings of this or that individual. Rather, it is the systematic expression of the way our institutions function and will continue to function unless impeded by an aroused public that comes to understand their nature and their true history. So, hold on, let me see. Yeah, exactly. I'm telling you this as a friend. It's Break. Break. It's like a homie. If you got spinach in your teeth, I'm gonna tell you. So just so you know, sit break. But no, shout out. So he's talking about this idea of the critics, the biggest governmental political critics actually in a certain way reinforce the system. Like, for instance, if you were criticizing LBJ or Nixon on the Vietnam War, right, telling him that like we should have never gotten involved in this war because it was this is detrimental to American value and quality of life. Like when you criticize individual people, this person did that. Like, America is supposed to be a country that honors other, national sovereignty, a country that spreads virtue. We're supposed to be a good nation. Right, but this person is departing from that. Someone like Trump, someone like Nixon, someone like Reagan. When you give individual examples, you're putting the blame on an individual. Where really, this is nothing new. This has been happening since time immemorial. This is a fundamental aspect, at least Chomsky is saying here, of an actual nation state. And so the critics, even though they can be the harshest ones, right? And like he even has this line, citizens, they won't even think outside of that box. If the harshest critic will even say that, then who am I to say to think otherwise? But again, it still kind of has implicit very much the agenda of a country. So he says a useful rule of thumb is this: if you want to learn something about the propaganda system, have a close look at the critics and their tacit assumptions. These typically constitute the doctrines of the state religion. And so he gives an example. He says, consider the tale of the Russian MiGs allegedly sent to Nicaragua, a fable nicely timed to divert attention from the Nicaraguan elections that we had sought to undermine and from the fact that we are sending advanced aircraft to El Salvador to facilitate the massacre of peasants. So, we come and we, interfere with and meddle with, all these different nations. And then we come up with a distraction, right? Something to divert attention, which is this idea of Russian MiGs being sent to Nicaragua. When the neatly timed MiG story was leaked by the administration, thus setting the framework for further discussion of the issues, senatorial doves made it clear that in that case, we would have a right to bomb Nicaragua. And in all of this, right, so that sets the framework. By fabricating this total lie, that is now the context in which we are discussing these things. I mean, I'm not super informed on the matter, but like, for instance, with Israel and Iran, Israel bombed Iran and they've been retaliating and this, that, and the other. And I know right now there's a huge propaganda push to talk about Iran is developing nuclear weapons, which I even remember when I was like younger, that was still a thing. And this goes back, at least 30, 40 years that Iran has been just on the brink of discovering, creating nuclear weapons. And this is, again, that's like this diversion, right? Ultimately, and I don't feel informed enough to like speak on this, but obviously there's tons of dynamics taking place with like Israel and Iran in the Middle East, and the United States using Israel as a proxy to establish the United States regime and to overthrow the Iranian regime. But right, what's being talked about now is the equivalent of this, MIG story. In many ways, it's a fabrication of sorts, or at the very least, a massive exaggeration about how, Iran has nuclear missiles, the nuclear missiles. They're right on the brink of it, which they've been on the brink of for decades. Exactly. What a tired playbook we have. And that's the thing too, this sets the framework now, right? Now everybody's talking about, well, is it ethical to actually do it? Like maybe aren't they entitled to it? And all, because if all the other nations have it, aren't they entitled to have their own security of national sovereignty? And then you have people on the other end where it's like, we cannot let Iran get nukes, because if they do, that's just one more power, and all the other stuff that the threats of nuclear warfare, right? That set the tone of the whole conversation. Meanwhile, behind the scenes is this whole underlying idea that Israel is trying to overthrow the Iranian regime. And like you said, with a tired playbook, Enlightened, this is what Chomsky is saying. None of this is new. This is exactly what states and nations have been doing as long as they've existed, right? Deceit, violence, deceit, and lawlessness are natural functions of the state, any state. And the critics, when they single out a specific person, that makes it seem like this is a unique instance, that this is a departure from what we normally do, when really this is the status quo. You can hear my throat. Look, sip break. All right. Okay, yeah, so he's talking about that. And also he's just putting this into context, with this specific situation with Nicaragua and the, fabrication of this Russian MIG story. Consider the threat that Nicaragua poses to us. By these standards, the USSR has a right to bomb Denmark, which is no less a threat to them than Nicaragua is to us. And he gives an example. He says, 50 years ago, Hitler warned that Czechoslovakia was a dagger pointed at the heart of Germany, an intolerable threat to its security. By our standards, Hitler appears to have been rather sane. And that's true. I've been reading The Rise and Fall of Third Reich, and yeah, he has this whole enormous propaganda campaign that Czechoslovakia is a threat to Germany, and they have horrible discrimination for the German minority in Czechoslovakia, which I forget if it was Czechoslovakia or one of the other countries, but the German minority actually had a relatively good standing there and were pretty well off, so to speak. But just like this total faking of the actual situation. And Hitler obviously was an insane person for saying that, and it was just a total lie, and we recognize that now. But using the US's logic that Nicaragua is a threat, and with the Russian MIGs, in that case Hitler seems by our standards relatively sane. So again, just giving examples, all of this just showing that the nation's going to do what the nation's going to do. They're going to have their totally immoral, behind the curtain acts, and propaganda is just a way of being able to manipulate public opinion in a way that allows them to continue doing what they're doing while not having the public overthrow them in some sense. It's, as he says, it's a mechanism of control. Let me see where we're at. Oh, okay, yeah. So he says, in earlier years, we were defending ourselves against other aggressors. So again, he's just kind of giving more examples of this. When Polk stole a third of Mexico, we were defending ourselves against Mexican aggression, initiated well inside Mexican territory. We had to take California to protect ourselves from a possible British threat to do so. The Indian Wars were also defensive. The Indians were attacking us from their British and Spanish sanctuaries, so we were compelled to take Florida and the West. So, always in all these cases, we are on the defensive, right? With Mexico, where we obviously had started the aggression, right? Polk claims that it was the Mexican aggression, which again initiated well inside Mexican territory. How is Mexico going to have aggression against the United States, like in the heart of Mexico? Obviously, there's something else going on there. And same thing with the Native Americans. Looking at the real history, we see the current attack on Nicaragua in a perspective different from the conventional one, and we can come to understand its causes in the normal and essentially invariant functioning of our own institutions. And we can also come to understand the brainwashing techniques employed to conceal what is happening before our eyes, where elementary truths are easily buried. So yeah, again, just these same fundamental ideas. These are the normal and essentially invariant functioning of our own institutions, and what we use is propaganda through social media, through just like the sort of public face that the government gives, through legacy media and things like that. These are the brainwashing techniques employed to conceal what is actually happening before our eyes. And again, elementary truths are easily buried. That's why I think Trump is such an interesting political figure, and definitely like, a propagandist, because he will just tell outright blatant lies. He's been doing that, since day one. And like even just like kind of a silly trivial example, but like, he's talking about just the other day, I heard eggs were, $1.98. Nowhere are eggs $1.98. That's cat. Or like same thing with gas. I think that's what he said. Gas was $2. That's just like a blatant lie, and yet so many people just eat it up. These are elementary truths are easily buried, and I think with someone like Trump too, he does what's it called? There's a word for it, like something pandering or hog. It's where you just throw just such a barrage of information, in this case a barrage of lies, that you, by the time you've caught up with one, we're already onto the next one. So in this case, elementary truths are being easily buried. Yeah, Washington. He actually said gas was $1.98, and that's not even, that's like a relative, like, that's obviously a lie, but I think there's much more insidious ways that someone like Trump has done this, but also someone more competent than like Trump. Trump is just fundamentally an incompetent person, so even when he does this, it's kind of see-through. But just as a mechanism of the state itself, this is the type of thing, and this is the kind of way in which they operate. So, he says, this case is just another contribution to familiar historical fraud, while the events themselves are just another chapter in a shameful and sordid history, concealed from us by a contrived history framed in terms of such ideals as the rule of law, Wilsonian principles of self-determination, democracy, and human rights, and, other things like that. The whole Cold War was basically based on, we have to protect democracy. We are bombing the fuck out of Vietnam because it's in their best interest, because we are trying to set up a democracy and fight the communist regime, right? And people really bought that, especially at the height of the Cold War. There was a huge fervor against anything communist. That's the Red Scare, and all of that was furnished and enforced by propaganda. Even like Hitler and the rise and fall of Third Reich, when Italy bails, and what's his name, was it Mussolini? I should know. I'm like literally reading it, so I'm pretty sure it was Mussolini. But he's like, so basically once Italy bails from the alliance that they had with Germany, Hitler was like, all right, that's cool, but at the very least, basically, can you do propaganda? Can you fill your media with as much, essentially lies about what's actually going on, making Germany look good, and, doing anything in your power to essentially brainwash your people to be on the side of Germany. That was an explicit request that Hitler made of Mussolini. The wholesale price, I'll try to give them benefit of the doubt. Yeah, they haven't dropped below $6 in Atlanta. Yeah, I mean, the $1.98, I'm pretty sure was gas, I think, which is absurd, because I think with eggs, he said it was even, they're the lowest they've ever been. So yeah, again, just saying, and we cloak this in the ideals of self-determination and democracy and human rights. America for a long time has had like the nickname, or what's like a derogatory nickname? I don't know the word for that, but like, they're called the world police, and like that's very much, we're going into Iraq to help set up to support democracies and do this, that, and the other, right? All of this is in the name of good old fashioned American values, but that's just obviously a facade of the exact opposite happening behind the scenes. So going on here to another example, the devastating bombing of northern Laos in the 1969 bombing and other attacks against Cambodia were suppressed by the media, a fact that is suppressed within the mainstream until today. These are called secret wars, meaning the government kept the attack secret. So this is also another form of propaganda, right? The complete, you're not necessarily telling lies, you're not, faking the truth. You're just completely omitting things that have happened, period, right? You just are completely keeping things in secret until, again, like this day. It's been years at this point that actually took place, and only just now is it finally being revealed that that's actually what happened behind the curtains, so to speak. But in the case of the American attack against South Vietnam, sufficient attacks were always available. They were observed but not seen. So then we have case like with Vietnam, right, which was just an atrocity on so many different levels, and that was just happening in plain view, right? But he says the facts were observed but not seen, which is this distinction that he's going to make and elaborate on going forward. So, writing about this, the official historian of the Kennedy administration, regarded as a leading dove, basically says this about Vietnam in 1962. 1962 had not been a bad year, he writes in his history, A Thousand Days. Aggression was checked in Vietnam. That is, and that, that's a quote. That is, the year in which the United States undertook direct aggression against South Vietnam was the year in which aggression was checked in Vietnam. Orwell would have been impressed. Whoever dropped 1984, there's the Orwell mention. Another respected figure in the liberal pantheon, Adlai Stevenson. Again, these are liberals, he was saying. These would be the so-called critics of the Vietnam War, which in many ways further perpetuate the actual, the system of government itself. So he says, he intoned at the United Nations that in Vietnam we were combating internal aggression, another phrase that Orwell would have admired. That is, we were combating aggression by the Vietnamese against us in Vietnam, just as we had earlier combated aggression by the Mexicans against us in Mexico a century earlier. We had done the same in Greece, intervening to protect Greece from the aggressors who had gained control of most of the country. These aggressors being the Greeks, who had led the anti-Nazi resistance and who we succeeded in removing with an impressive display of massacre, torture, expulsion, and general violence in favor of the Nazi collaborators of our choice. So, here are all these examples where we're, again, just using media, right? Aggression was checked in Vietnam the very year that the United States had, one of its greatest forms of aggression against in the war of Vietnam. And again, we're always on the defensive. We're protecting ourselves in the same way that we protected ourselves in the, in the heart of Mexico. Fudging and rewriting, representing, reframing the facts in a way that just completely hides what's actually taking place. So, let's see. Oh, yeah, okay. So, as always, the American posture is defensive, even as we invade a country halfway around the world after having failed to destroy the political opposition by large-scale violence and terror. And I think the thing is, so this is the power of propaganda. We are literally invading a country halfway around the world, and yet it's we who are on the defensive. And what's so insidious, I think, about propaganda is the fact that it works. Like I said, William Shirer, when he was talking to the everyday lay people of Germany, they totally just bought everything that they were being sold. And, to a large extent, we do that here. And people are just it's an interesting psychological principle, honestly, like how things happening directly in front of our eyes, if we are just, brainwashed, that's a really a great term for it. Because, we observe the facts, but they're not seen. We see all this happening before our eyes, but we fail to connect what is actually taking place, right? We just buy the lies wholesale. And so now he's kind of going higher level here, right? He's talking about this is the genius of democratic systems of thought control, which differ markedly from totalitarian practice. So he's going to talk about thought control with totalitarian regimes and then with democracies like America. Those who rule by violence tend to be behaviorist in their outlook. What people may think is not terribly important. What counts is what they do. They must obey, and this obedience is secured by force. The penalties for disobedience vary depending on the characteristic of the state. So the USSR, for instance, they might use psychiatric torture or exile or prison. And in a typical U.S. dependency, such as El Salvador, you might be found in a ditch decapitated after hideous torture. So in totalitarian societies, we don't really care what the people think, right? The whole point of being authoritarian is that you are the authority, you are enforcing, and you are forcing the people to do your bidding. And it doesn't necessarily matter what the people actually think. And, if you want to go against that, then, yeah, you might be found in a ditch, you might get tortured, you might get killed. Or if, you might get sent to a concentration camp, you might get sent to the gulag, right? All these different forms in which that takes place. Democratic systems, however, are quite different. It is necessary to control not only what people do, but also what they think. Since the state lacks the capacity to ensure obedience by force, thought can lead to action, and therefore the threat to order must be excised at the source. It is necessary to establish a framework for possible thought that is constrained within the principles of the state religion. So this is the idea right now that it's psychological sort of forms of control, thought control. And as he says, a framework of possible thought must be constrained, right? These need not be asserted. It is better that they are presupposed as the unstated framework for thinkable thought. The critics, as we have been saying, reinforce this system by tacitly accepting these doctrines and confining their critique to tactical questions that arise within them. So he's going to give this example, for instance, in the Vietnam War with the Hawks and the Doves, right? There are people who are the Hawks would be, pro-aggression. Let's bomb Vietnam even more. Let's be even more aggressive. Whereas the Doves, who would be the critics of the Vietnam War, they still act within that framework. They're like, maybe the U.S. was on the right track, but ultimately, Vietnam was a mistake, or it's impractical. It's not realistic for us to actually be there. And so there's, pros and cons, but outside of this whole framework of thought is just the idea that why the hell are we even there, right? What reason was there for the U.S. to intervene in a country halfway around the world and do horrible things unto these people who did not ask for us, and just why don't we embrace the option of peace, right? That is not discussed within the acceptable frame of thought, the Hawks versus Doves. So let's see. Washington says, hard question. Does understanding the use of propaganda give you empathy for those people that fell for Nazi movement in Germany? And then Enlighten says, if it doesn't, the absence of free will might get you the rest of the way there. Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question. I think, you do have to have some kind of, well, okay, let me back up here. Because I think the question of, how did people just stand by and let what happened in Germany with the concentration camps and the Holocaust, how did they just let that happen? I think we can see that very well in the United States. Like, obviously, we're not at full-on Holocaust level, but we've essentially set up, faux concentration camps in Guatemala, which are completely outside the law, like the normal U.S. laws, right? We made that place basically so we could torture terrorists out because that's illegal in the U.S. And, we've set up camps which are like, or I don't know exactly what they call them, but, we're just deporting tens of thousands of people there. And, with ICE, with people without having warrants, officers who are just masked up, taking people with no paperwork, no official permission to do so, and taking people like fresh out of like their graduations. Literally, they'll be in immigration court, they're going through the immigration process legally, and you have ICE masked up taking them away, right? This is that type of shit. This is how that kind of started. The Holocaust and concentration camps, that began with mass deportations. And how did this all happen? How did Germany let that happen? Well, you can see people are in favor of this. Obviously, like, there's a huge amount of pushback against it, but there's also a huge proportion of people that are that voted for this, that are absolutely in agreement with this. And in terms of the propaganda question, do we have some level of sympathy, or at least empathy? I would be inclined to say yes. I mean, I do think there is some kind of individual responsibility, just kind of like wake up, not to be brainwashed, essentially, not because someone like William Shirer, like I've been mentioning, he's being fed this steady stream of propaganda. Although what he might say, he had connections, right? Because he was like a foreign correspondent, he was also getting news from all over the country, which like completely does not resemble the news that's happening in Germany. In fact, to his credit and to this question, he's even saying, I think he even expresses empathy in the way that you just said, Washington, where he's like, if I was being constantly fed this endless stream and diet of just Germans being persecuted and discriminated against, and just like this endless stream, this is their only source of information about what is happening in the outside world. Like, I think William Shirer even says, if you were going based solely off Germany, you would think they'd be absolutely justified in what they're doing. So I mean, I guess it's a trade-off between, like, at some level you need to just, kind of wake up. At some point it reaches a point where it's like, okay, what's going on? By the time we're invading the third country because of, aggression against German minorities, maybe we need to start thinking about it more. But yeah, I mean, I guess I would have empathy. This idea of social conditioning. I mean, if I may be frank here for a moment, I kind of grew up in a mostly kind of like, Christian conservative household, to the point like I used to think, ugh, I'm not a big fan of like gay marriage, and you're like, I'm not a big fan of atheists. But that's because, that at my age I had just like, when you're that young, you just kind of regurgitate the kind of things that you have been taught. So like, if you're someone, for instance, like born and raised in the South, like surrounded by like, racist people and the people you love and the people you're friends with, and you just see it all around you, and especially if you're getting fed this endless stream of, propaganda, you like, it might not be right, obviously, but you can absolutely see how someone can fall into that trap. And you also have, stories of people who were in that space and eventually found their way out, and they look back on it with shame and regret. But they talk about how, when you're so immersed in it, you don't even know better to know better in a certain sense. So, yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Washington. I obviously don't have a definitive answer, but that's a good discussion question. And then Enlightened said, people care about number one first. Taking antagonistic action can have severe consequences for number one and their loved ones. It's definitely a hard and complicated position to be in. Yeah, not to mention the fact that there might be like, political or actual, personal, individual, safety concerns, especially like in something like Nazi Germany, where if you do speak out, that's the thing. Also, that's why it's almost good in a certain way Trump is so, profoundly incompetent, because like someone like Hitler, if you voiced opposition to the Nazi party, jailed, killed, concentration camp, right? And so there is this level of how much of it is social conditioning, how much of it is also just, self-preservation. But I do think look at how much we're brainwashed already, and we have, free press, free media, obviously kind of like little asterisks there. But could you imagine if Trump was able to secure connection or to secure control over all the main media reports and was just, fabricating and fabricating? Realistically, how many Americans do you think would not fall for the bait there? I think it's appallingly low. And again, who knows? You have to, it's like, what's bro's name? The fucking thumb. What? Man's Search for Meaning. Oh, Viktor Frankl. I don't know why it took me so long to think of. Viktor Frankl even has, I think it's a very interesting thing that he does in that book. He says, you, the reader, must ask yourself in all honesty if in those same conditions you might not have done the same. And, if you ask yourself, if you're brought up and you're surrounded in a society that, that is completely brainwashed and steeped in these propagandizing mechanisms, do you really think you would be immune? Because we've seen time and time again how we're already not immune, let alone if you made it just a full scale propaganda program. So yeah, that's a really good question, Washington. And yeah, I almost lean more towards the empathy part, except it's hard after a certain point. It gets hard to kind of be too empathetic. But yeah, very good question. And then again, talking about like the critics, for instance, and he even says too, totalitarian governments might do well to actually have critics. That way, there's at least the illusion of the ability to critique and stand out against the government, where really there is none. And Washington says, which makes me really appreciate the people in power who thought of checks and balances, even if it's laced with corruption. Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly what the founding fathers were trying to do. They were trying to build it into the system and able to fight against this thing. And I mean, and look how much it's encroached upon it, right? What if we didn't have the First Amendment, the freedom of right to assembly and freedom of speech and things like that? You can only imagine. It's still happening, even with the actual Constitution and foundation of the government set up in like explicitly to counter these kinds of things. And then again, with the nature of the critics, if even the harshest critics tacitly adopt these premises, then the ordinary person may ask, Who am I to disagree? The more intensely the debate rages between hawks and doves, the more firmly and effectively the doctrines of the state religion are established. It is because of their notable contribution to thought control that the critics are tolerated, indeed honored, that is, those who play by the rules. So this debate rages on between the hawks and the doves, right? The hawks are just, we need to go, whole hog. We need to fully commit ourselves and go be more and more aggressive. The doves speak about it in terms of it's not practical, it's not realistic. This war is costing us hundreds of millions. Tons of lives are being lost. But the more that debate rages on, the more it sets the framework of the larger question, which is why the hell again are we even there? Right? That never enters the critical discussion of what's taking place, in this case in the Vietnam War, but you can imagine in all the other situations that this might apply to. And so writing on later, he says 3/4 of the population may support a nuclear freeze, and some of them may even know that this is official Soviet policy as well. But that has no impact on the policy of massive government intervention to subsidize high technology industry, blah, blah, blah. The idea that, propaganda in many ways, for instance, with something like universal healthcare, I think on both sides, for the most part, it is an extremely popular opinion that there should be some level of free healthcare. But again, all this propagandizing and the right versus left and the intensification of tensions between, the right and the left and villainizing one another, it completely distracts the conversation, right? How much is universal healthcare talked about relative to, like immigration or, trans people in sports and things like that? It diverts attention. It diverts attention. So let me see here. Here, let me take a sip break. Okay, and so he's talking about, in this case, something like protests. He says mass popular resistance to military aggression does serve in some ways as an impediment to the planners, but such resistance, while sometimes effective in raising the costs of state violence, is of limited efficacy as long as it is not based on understanding of the forces at work and the reasons for their systematic behavior. So, civil disobedience, protest, massive resistance, this is good in some ways, right? It can increase the cost of state violence and it has limited efficacy, but as long as we're not realizing the deeper underlying thing, right? Anytime some specific issue comes up, people might protest, people might resist, but again, remember, that issue is just the one manifestation of the invariant operating, as he says, of the state. These are things that happen time and time again. And until we realize this larger principle, and again, with related to, propaganda, until we realize the mechanisms of thought control that are being exercised on us, we're never going to truly address the root of all these issues. Consider, for example, the current debate as to whether there is a symmetry between El Salvador and Nicaragua, and that each case, rebels supported from abroad are attempting to overthrow the government. The administration claims that in one case, the rebels are freedom fighters and the government is an illegitimate tyranny, while in the other case, the rebels are terrorists and the government is still somewhat flawed democracy. So he's talking about like a conversation, a debate that's happening at that time between whether or not there is this parallel between what's been happening in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And then so one, we have the cases where, rebels are considered freedom fighters, and the other case, they're considered terrorists, and there's this whole debate going on, right? As Chomsky says, lost in the debate is a more striking symmetry. In each country, there is a terrorist military force that is massacring civilians, and in each country, we support that force. The government of El Salvador and the Contras. So it's like, while this whole debate is raging about like, okay, are they freedom fighters? Are they terrorists? Is there, what's the parallels between El Salvador and Nicaragua, right? All of that, meanwhile, we are failing to realize, a more striking symmetry, which is to say the actual underlying problem here at the root of it. It's the fact that in each country, there's a terrorist military force massacring citizens and that the U.S. supports those forces. But that never enters the discussion. That is not what's allowed in the realm of possible thought. And that's why the critics, he says, are actually they're not only tolerated, but honored in democracy, because they further, right, by even just operating within that very framework of like, the government agenda, just operating within that framework, that further goes on to, you know, perpetuate and solidify it. Whereas really we're failing to see the actual underlying thing, you know, this entire time. Okay, and so wrapping up here. Over 60 years ago, Walter Lippmann discussed the concept of the manufacture of consent, an art that is capable of great refinements and that may lead to a revolution in the practice of democracy. The idea was taken up with much enthusiasm in business circles. It is a main preoccupation of the public relations industry, whose leading figure, Edward Bernays, describes the engineering of consent as the very essence of democracy. And this is also related to even just like advertising. I've dipped a little bit into that propaganda. It's a book called Propaganda by Edward Bernays. And yeah, the engineering of social consent, the engineering of public opinion, that's what's at the heart of all this. The manufacture of consent, which again, the title of the essay, and as Walter Lippmann says, capable of great refinements. You know, when you treat this almost as like an art, there you can see how this, you know, for instance, like I've been talking about Trump and everything, you can see how propaganda in the hands of a more able and competent person could be a vastly powerful mechanism of control. It already is, even in the hands of someone who's totally, you know, incompetent to deal with it. But all right, am I back, folks? Let me know in the chat. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you, appreciate it. Sorry, router got unplugged. Okay, we're just gonna jump right back in. So did we get to the propaganda part? I forget where with the Edward Bernays. I don't know where it chopped out. Well, either way, I'll just get back into it. It was this whole idea of the manufacture of consent and the engineering of consent, and essentially of you know, public opinion, the American. I mean, obviously not just America, but the mind of a people's. And sorry, hold on. I'm just reorienting. So yeah, the idea that the public mind was the object of a cultural and ideological industry that was unrelenting as it was diverse, ranging from the school to the press to mass culture in its multitudinous dimensions. So this idea too, you know, it really is, it's not just something like mainstream media and news and stuff like this. This is something that goes, I mean, his example, he was walking through the park and he saw a tombstone where, again, hundreds of people probably saw this, where there was, you know, they seemed to read this without any reaction, you know, just walking past this thing where it said Native Americans gave of themselves and gave of their lives. He was going through the university. There's a stained glass window, right? This is everywhere. Even with education, the way in which like we teach our history and stuff, or for instance, what's omitted from history. So it's as multitudinous and diverse as it is, you know, widespread. And I thought this was interesting too. He says the reason, as an AT&T vice president put it in 1909, is that the public mind is, in my judgment, the only serious danger confronting the company. And I think that statement applies just as much almost to, you know, the American government. The public mind is the only serious danger confronting the government. So, and you know, that's why this mechanism is so controlled, and that's why it's so, you know, startling that someone like Elon Musk again owns Twitter, which is like, you know, one of the biggest social media corporations. And dude obviously has a very, very far right-leaning, if not just explicitly, you know, pro-neo-Nazi, as we remember. Someone gonna clip that out of context. Also, someone's going to clip that out of context, as if anybody would do that. But you guys know what I'm talking about, the event where he did that. And then, for instance, on Facebook, if I'm not mistaken, you know, anytime you start a new account, you're automatically following Donald Trump. I'm pretty sure, I forget if it was Donald Trump, but you start out in these, like, you know, social media accounts as already following, you know, certain people. Which again, you know, it's relatively minor, but that's the kind of stuff that is the engineering of consent, you know, pushing a certain narrative. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but the stuff with Elon Musk's AI, you know, Grok, and how there's been this explicit push for like the white genocide in South Africa, and how anytime someone asks, Grok is literally, you know, total fumble on Elon's part, where Grok will explicitly say, like, you know, people's, you know, that's actually like, you know, not very, there's no evidence to support this. This is something that I've been programmed to say. It virtually said those exact same things, where it's like, you know, I've been instructed to push a certain narrative. And so, and for instance, with like the the I think it's DeepSeek, the Chinese AI, they won't mention anything about like the Tiananmen Square massacre. So these are the kinds of things, especially, you know, we've talked about like, you know, the nature of AI and its encroaching nature on society and things like that. So you can only imagine the way in which the nature of propaganda, the nature of manipulating public opinion will rear its ugly head in so many different things, right? Education, social media, but even things like, you know, Google or social media sites, or just like, you know, search engines, just generally, you know, all these different kinds of things. And then so I love this. I think this is a great summary of what we've been talking about. Propaganda is to democracy what violence is to totalitarianism. The techniques have been honed to a high. Oh my god. The techniques have been honed to a Propaganda is to democracy what violence is to totalitarianism. The techniques have been honed to a high art, far beyond anything that Orwell dreamt of. The device of feigned dissent, incorporating the doctrines of the state religion and eliminating rational critical discussion, is one of its more subtle means. I love, you know, the idea of the feigned dissent. That's the idea of, you know, we'll allow the critics to keep doing their thing. Incorporating the doctrines of state religion, eliminating rational critical discussion, again, setting the bounds of what is allowed to and to not be talked about within the confines, you know, everything that we've just been talking about. And so wrapping up here, for those who stubbornly seek freedom, there can be no more urgent task than to come to understand the mechanisms and practices of indoctrination. These are easy to perceive in the totalitarian societies, much less so in the system of brainwashing under freedom to which we are subjected and which all too often we serve as willing or unwitting instruments. So the real call to action here that Noam Chomsky is saying is it is extremely urgent to understand the mechanisms, right? Not to just passively be influenced by what's taking place, but to recognize it once you see it, and to once we understand these mechanisms of control and to understand the way in which government is manipulating public opinion, well, then we have a much better understanding of what's taking place. It's this urgent need, right? And this is the type of stuff, you know, I don't think I had even been halfway even conscious of this idea until, you know, like, you know, reading more about history, reading more nonfiction, getting like, you know, reading essays like this. But, you know, before, you know, when I was younger, especially, that's some shit I would not have even, you know, really considered. And I think, you know, many people are not, you know, politically inclined or politically active, and, you know, for a number of different reasons. I mean, I think it's another thing too with like the capitalism stuff, when, you know, because a lot of things that people will say is like, who has time to get involved in politics? Who has time to worry about Israel and Iran when, you know, you can't even put food on the table? And it's a fair, you know, that's a valid concern. You know, I think that's even part of it. Keep people so busy in, you know, the capitalist engine that they don't have time to even worry about this stuff, right? So, you know, tons of good stuff here. Like, I think this is very important, especially in you know, today's society, so to speak. But yeah, that wraps up the essay, The Manufacture of Consent by Noam Chomsky. Tons of good stuff. And let's see, we got a comment here from Washing Toad. It's crazy to think that normal people who are left-leaning or right-leaning politically have more in common with each other than they ever will with a billionaire who's only out to increase their own power, yet they choose to fight one another due to the power of legacy media propaganda. Washington, I think that's absolutely on point. Like, if you ever have a conversation with just a relatively normal person, you know, whether they're on the right-leaning side, whether they're on the left-leaning side. For instance, my dad is like, you know, Republican, but he was actually like pro-Bernie at first. You know, my dad, like, ultimately, I think a lot of people, really what it is working class versus kind of like, you know, the elite billionaire millionaires, right? And it's just like, we really do, anytime I kind of talk to someone who's like conservative Republican, anytime it comes up, it's like, okay, should there be, you know, some level of healthcare? Yeah, they agree that there should be. You know, we might disagree, we might disagree to varying degrees, but, you know, and like with you know, gun control and stuff like that, like, I don't think anybody would deny surely there should be, you know, some level of background check. You know, we don't necessarily need to outlaw guns completely, but there should be some kind of middle ground. You know, the point is, like you said, Washington, a lot of people, I think, ultimately have a lot more in common. But you see this too with public figures. Like they're totally cool, very, they have integrity intellectually and stuff. And then you see mofos just get on Twitter or get on any of these social medias, and it's like they just go down this whole path. Like they really do, like the word that I think describes it, and which people have used to like describe the phenomenon. It's really like they become like brainwashed or like, brain rotted. And it's like all of a sudden these people are spending so much of their time talking about things that I have never at once in my life really had any this has never impacted me. Like the immigrant criminals and stuff, which obviously is massively hyperinflated. There's tons of research that shows immigrants actually commit less crimes than like the average US citizens for obvious fucking reasons. But like immigrants make up the backbone. They do all the hard labor, the factory work, they pick the fruit, they do all the farm labor, they do all the shit jobs that we don't want to do. Immigrants are the backbone of this country, for instance. And also, they're your friends, they're your neighbors. Like I used to work at restaurants. 3/4 of back of house probably are somebody who would be eligible to get, just taken up and raided in ICE. Like most people are not in favor of these kinds of things, but again, like you say, the media just pits it and intensifies it. Like, would we really be this divided culturally if social media does not exist? It's an interesting question. And like you said, cool cult, infighting is a huge misdirection. That's exactly what Noam Chomsky has been saying. The misdirection, the diverting of attention to obfuscate what's actually the problem, right? What's actually the problem is everything that we've talked about, like, these massive billionaires who are getting soaking up like a sponge, more and more tax cuts, while like simultaneously cutting like basic social programs like SNAP and Medicaid. Another good example of this, actually, which my girl was telling me about in a book she was reading, where we hear about things like, SNAP and Medicaid, these social programs to help people that are basically impoverished. And the way that's framed is, there's the welfare queens. These are people that are leeches of the state. They're taking handouts. My taxes are paying for somebody to just, be a lazy bum all day and take unemployment. Right. So that's like that's the narrative around it. But meanwhile, I mean, first off, that's, that's totally overinflated. There might be some, degree of people who manipulate this, but oftentimes these are, people who desperately need these social programs because they're so damn impoverished. And, often, mothers working 2 jobs. That's the kind of shit. I was on food stamps when I was a grad student because I was just that fucking broke. But then, on the other hand, you have things like tax cuts, right? Which is effectively the same thing. Massive tax cuts for the rich, where that's essentially, hundreds of billions, hundreds of millions more dollar in their pocket. But nobody views tax cuts, right? It's not like rich people are welfare queens. It's not like they're leeches off the state. But those are identical. Those are ultimately identical things, right? One is kind of viewed as like a positive in the sense that it's like, they are giving money to people, whereas something like tax cuts is like a sort of negative in the sense that it's like we are giving you a tax cut break. But social welfare programs and tax cuts are virtually doing identical things, except the only people we vilify are the people who get that tiny slice of the pie with the social welfare programs that desperately need it because they're getting fucked by, for instance, the people who are just getting more and more tax cuts. So that's another example of like, the propaganda, the way of framing things it completely changes how people view this. Enlighten, are your comments showing up? Enlighten, I didn't see your comment until you had said back, so I'm going to say no. But I do. So, Nate, do you think any form of hierarchical government could work? Obviously, it works like this, but just makes you think about what an answer could be. I just came to the conclusion long ago that I don't see any way out. If we abolish government, we go back to tribes and barbarism and boot medicine and technology. If we move to one world government, we move to a society with a huge population of states and pauper/gang violence, far less freedom. Feels like damned if we do, damned if we don't situations on this. Okay, yeah. I agree. I mean, I think ultimately the problem with government in general is, power corrupts. That's a fundamental principle. This goes back even to, Plato, the Republic. He basically outlines all these different types of governments and how in virtually every single case there's going to be some way in which people abuse it. And then, that's why he puts forth this whole idea of like the philosopher king and everything. And also this idea that the people who are attracted to politics are essentially the last kind of people you want in politics, right? They are people who are hungry for power, hungry for, to be, hungry for power in a way that allows them to benefit and use corruption, for instance, whereas the people who least want to go in government, which like Plato talks about as the philosopher king, these are the people who should actually be there. And so to get to your question, Enlighten, I don't know. I mean, I feel like there are governments in the world, like, like Switzerland seems like they're doing fine. For instance, that just random example, but like, I don't know. I do feel like a lot of this stuff ultimately I think could be resolved with basic, like, the purpose of the government is to, like, provide for the people, and I think half of what we talk about now could honestly be fixed with just like decent education. Knowledge is power, as they say. Like, once you're aware of this kind of stuff and you can recognize it, then you can do something to actually combat it. But ultimately, I don't know. About whether or not there's any kind of government that could actually work, because at the heart of all governments, I think, is corruption, which, unless you plan on expunging corruption from human nature, which of course is impossible, then I don't know. I mean, obviously there's better and worse ways to do it, but I do not have an answer to your question, Enlighten. Washing Toad says, we just need to emphasize to the next generation the important concept of sharing and doing our best to prevent the power of greed to poison the next generation, which again in many ways just boils down to education and basic empathy, like, and also combat, maybe if there's some way to combat propaganda, right? Like, if we could tone down in some meaningful way, like the all the dangers and detriments that social media is doing to society, I think that would work wonders. And also, just like basic human compassion in a certain way, like, the ability to just, talk to one another, and also just realize who the real enemy here is in this case, right? Once we recognize this, propaganda is constantly trying to divert our attention to prevent understanding. So if we can combat the propaganda itself and, prevent ourselves from being misdirected, and to prevent ourselves from, failing to understand things, I think that would work wonders. But that also requires, a lot of, like, how much of the population realistically will do that? I mean, again, it's kind of fucked up, but the reason Plato was so against something like democracy is because he's like, the masses are stupid. And I think that's kind of like that's kind of been a principle since the beginning of time, right? The masses generally don't think critically and deeply about, like, the political situation, and that's why they are so easily swayed. So I mean, that's even something I feel like David Foster Wallace has been talking about, like, that we've talked about on stream. Have I ever read Ursula K. Le Guin? I feel like you would like The Dispossessed. Yes, in fact, that made it on my modern classics tier list. I'm not going to tell you where it landed, but I fuck with The Dispossessed heavily. And that's in it, yeah, I mean, that, because in The Dispossessed, they have a total anarchist government, and it's like, people themselves end up kind of spontaneously forming a sort of government, almost in a kind of communal ancient tribal sense, right? Ancient tribes, as far as I understand it, didn't have full formal governments. It was kind of enforced. There were social norms that were enforced by people, right? If somebody did something wrong, well, you're gonna get your ass beat, right? There's no formal government, but they do have a way of kind of self-regulating themselves and keeping themselves in check. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's actually a really interesting question, because ultimately at the heart of all this stuff is the way in which a government operates. And so what is the ideal form of a government? And like I've just been mentioning, that was the whole point of the Republic, is, what would an ideal government look like? And, he gives his answer. I'm not sure how satisfying it is, but yeah, I mean, I think my answer to that generally is that, like, corruption is going to be a fundamental part of human nature, and the best you can do is just trying to, like, fight against it to the best of your ability. Like, Carl Jung has a line where basically, like, if we acknowledge evil as an actual, if you recognize evil as, like, an inextricable part of human nature, right? Once you recognize it, he gives an example of, like, the pilot flame, right? Once you realize that it's there, you can turn the flame down as much as you possibly can, whereas otherwise it's just gonna, if you continue to deny or just you're ignorant of its existence, then you will fail to control it in any meaningful way. Can't wait for the tier list. I'm going to be enjoying a lovely beer while watching that. Okay, well, it should be coming soon within the next, like, day or so. Yeah, we got 70 books that I went through for the modern classics. I didn't even touch, like, the classics. So, all right, well, I appreciate you guys for pulling up to yet another wildly successful stream talking about The Manufacture of Consent by Noam Chomsky. Happy to be a part of the community. We have a nice gather. I agree, yes, and we only going up from here. And like we only going up from here. So hopefully you guys got something out of this essay. I know we've been kind of all over the place, but I kind of like that. I feel like we should get a good range of reading experiences. There we go. We got the emoji. Good shit. Cool, Colt. And oh, there we go. There we go. Look at that. Beautiful. So okay, for the next reading, I think we should do Recitaf by Toni Morrison, which I've been kind of teasing for the last few times, but I feel like this would be a good time to get into it. So going to be a lot of interesting stuff there, especially with like, you know, Freud and the nature of repression and psychoanalysis and stuff, and of course too like the dynamics of like, you know, the African American experience. So yeah, I'm hyped to do that. I'll post a PDF in the Discord. But yes, we will be reading Recitaf next time. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Appreciate all the love that you guys be showing. And, you know, another fire stream. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Peace out.